All right.
Good morning. My name's Jeff Scott, and I'm sitting next to Alan Smith, and we are broadcasting from Julia's in beautiful Charlotte, South Charlotte. We're next to the Restore, hence the housing and construction equipment, and we've promised not to use
No housing puns.
no housing
this time.
puns.
Yes,
But we frequently break our promises, don't we?
that is true. We're going to leave the door open.
Thank you, Alan. We have a special show today because of the ruling yesterday. But before we go into the Supreme Court decision, talking a little bit about the details of that case and what's important for voters to know, we should talk a little bit about why we're here and why we're doing this, because it's going to have implications for what we talk about later in the show and the importance of voter choice. So, Alan, would you like to say a few things about why we're here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many people watching probably know, we have what's essentially a two-party duopoly. And the Democrats and Republicans, they tend to control the conversation in elections. And I'm not okay with that, and I think that Jeff is not okay with that. And there are certain topics that never get discussed over the course of elections just because that's not what has been prescribed by these two parties. So Jeff and I want to campaign together to raise these issues, to have these conversations that deserve to be happening in this election cycle, especially in a special election cycle like this, where people are so tightly focused on other issues. We want to raise the issues that are important to people in the community that have big implications, especially like the things we're going to be talking about today.
That's right. And in the coming weeks, I think one interesting thing is the fact that the Democratic primaries are going on at the same time that we are participating in the special election. That's the fabulous baristas downstairs making espressos. They're very good. It's local Magnolia coffee, so come here when you want a good cappuccino.
It's really good.
But the Democratic debates were last night. We're not going to talk about that right now because of this important decision that really does affect North Carolina and the rest of the nation. And all eyes, again, are focused on North Carolina's politics. Last week, we started off in a similar vein, talking about ICE, DHS, and Sheriff McFadden, because that is a national issue that focuses people on our city and in this district. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. I know at the outset here, let me say that many voters simply don't pay attention to what's going on in the highest court. So this information probably hasn't filtered out to a lot of people yet. If you are a follower of social media and participate in social media, you've certainly seen the headlines, you've seen the reactions, you've seen that the Republicans are giddy with excitement. And the Democrats, some of them, including our local Senator Jeff Jackson and our competitor Dan McCready, think that this is absolutely the worst thing ever. So there's a lot of angst on the Democratic side. So let me do a little what they call mansplaining on this topic for just a moment. The Supreme Court made a very simple decision on a very complex issue of election rigging, essentially. They didn't say we don't have the jurisdiction. It wasn't a jurisdiction question. The issue was simply beyond their reach. So that's right there on the first or second page of the decision. And I think that's what really shocks a lot of people, because just to step back for a moment, we are in this race because there was significant election fraud in 2018 by the Republicans, who acted very unprofessionally at the very least, and essentially were cheating. So we're here because of this firestorm that they created last year. And here we are again, where they are rigging, cheating, gerrymandering. Not that their hands are particularly clean, but the point is here that they feel like right now, with this decision out of the court's hands, that they are in the catbird seat, and that they have a victory. No one can really challenge the fact that they have drawn district lines in such a way as to preserve their majority share of Congress. So let me say one other thing and then hand it over to you, which is that we have a state of a certain size and a certain population, and we get a certain number of representatives based on that. And district lines are drawn. They're supposed to be drawn in a fairly neutral fashion, but over time, they have been drawn in such a way as to preserve certain types of majorities. So this is simply rigging. So I know I've left a lot out of this description, but go ahead and tell me your understanding.
Yeah, and I mean that's basically it. And just to add a few more things to what you said, Jeff, I noticed in reading through the opinion of I read both Justice Roberts' opinion and then also the dissenting opinion from Justice Kagan. And it's interesting that Justice Roberts points out that gerrymandering, political gerrymandering, has been going on for a long time. This is not something new that North Carolina Republicans figured out 10 years ago. When we
That's right.
redrew the lines. But I think what's really interesting in the way that they presented the opinion of the court to say that this is not a judicial issue. Basically, this is an issue of law. And Justice Roberts pointed out that legislators, through Congress or even through state legislatures, have all the tools they need to fix this. This is not something that you need to turn to the courts on. And I think, to me, I read that, and this is only my opinion here, I read the tone in that as the courts saying, y'all got yourselves into this mess. You had plenty of time to do something through legislation to prevent political gerrymandering. The two of y'all, Democrats and Republicans, have done this. Now you have to work together to figure out how to fix it. Because as we talked about earlier, before we went live here, the Republicans are not always going to be in control. They're not always going to have the majority. So it's in their interest to fix things.
That's right. So the question is, will they follow, let's say, will they have a good conscience knowing, will they approach this issue fairly, knowing that they could be out of power and the same thing could happen to them in the future? And
the one other thing that I would add is I have to think about this more, but I appreciate the way that they framed this opinion, because as a third party candidate, I think we get into dangerous territory when we start having the Supreme Court decide matters, anchoring things on the Democrats and the Republicans, because the Democrats and Republicans may not always be around. We have fluid parties.
Right.
And so when we get into a situation like that, then you really are injecting partisanship into our judicial process. And I think that that's dangerous long term. So I think long term, this is going to have a positive outcome for third party candidates.
And let's talk more about that in a few minutes, because I wanted to say one thing about how the voters in the parties themselves, I think, are somewhat divided on this too. So this is another issue that does cross party lines, can divide parties are not necessarily unified on this particular topic. So even libertarians, I know our state party issued a press release yesterday supporting the fair districting principles. But many other libertarians feel like the court has put us in the odd spot of basically catch-22. If you know what a catch-22 is, you're just in a sort of a circular logic where, well, the solution is to be found through the legislature, yet the legislature is selecting their voters that support them. So it feels like you're really on a treadmill. What's the thing the hamster goes into?
Oh, it's a hamster wheel.
Yeah, the hamster
I
wheel.
think that's what it's called. Yeah.
So there doesn't seem to be a way out. So many people read this decision as now we're really trapped. There's really no way out. So I did have the foresight to listen at the time to the audio of the arguments, and those were the very capable complainants. The people who are bringing the charges against Rucho, who was in the Senate Republican who was charged with this. They had the claim that they wanted the justices to fix this unfairness problem. And I think that a lot of people reacted to the decision as you didn't fix the unfairness. So we still have a rigged system. We're still on the hamster wheel. The legislature will continue to dominate. The only way that we can survive, the only way that we can fix this is by voting for Democrats, right? So that's, to me, that's a very self-serving argument. So let's talk about what voters really need to know about this, because we've tried to discuss some of the details without going too far into it, and it is difficult to read 70-page legal decisions. I tried to read Kagan's dissent to try to get as much out of it as I could, but it's pretty complicated stuff, especially for the average voter. So what do you think voters should take away from this?
I think one thing that's important for voters to take away is to remember that, and granted, I'm a third-party candidate just like you, so maybe my view is skewed a little bit, but political parties don't own your vote. So they may try to district people in a certain way that stacks the deck against one particular political party.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the Republicans and the Democrats don't control who you vote for. And I think that was one thing that actually came through in the majority opinion, which I thought was really interesting. And I won't read everything here, but so Justice Roberts said, voters elect individual candidates in individual districts, and their selections depend on the issues that matter to them, the quality of the candidates, the tone of the candidates' campaigns, the performance of an incumbent, national events, local issues that drive voter turnout, and other considerations. I agree with that. I think that, and I want to believe that that's how democracy works. And I think that for the average voter, just to remember that you can vote for whoever you want to. It doesn't matter how we are districted. You run into this vote dilution issue, which is in the dissenting opinion. But for the average person, just to remember, you can vote for whoever you want to.
That's true. You can. So one problem is, as I've thought about this problem, voters have become, unfortunately, somewhat predictable. So if you look at what the Fair Districts NC group does, and it's important to pay attention to some of their reforms. Let me put a shout out to them at the moment. You can find them on Facebook, and they're doing various events throughout the state talking about their principles of reform. You can also go to lpnc.org to see the Libertarian Party's statement of support for those principles. One of the key things that they have focused on, and this was in, I think, Kagan's dissent also, was the incredible level of data mining, data manipulation that the parties can do, that they can afford to do, that they're paid to do, in order to determine how people are going to vote. So it's unfortunately, it's a sorry state of affairs if we are that predictable. If they know that we're going to sway a certain way, they can control themselves. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument that many libertarians make, and I'm sure this goes across party lines, but that we are in this catch-22 because we've become I don't know. I don't want to call it lazy, because I know that everybody's got, their demands on their time, and not everybody can be fully informed. And we have an ideal in our democracy that we want to inform people to make sure that they can make smart decisions. But in the end, it turns out some of our decisions are kind of based on an algorithm that computers can figure out, and so we've become predictable.
Yeah.
So that doesn't. Is that good for democracy, that we've become so predictable? I know that's a tough question. I don't expect you to give a fantastic answer to it, because I don't have a fantastic answer to it. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a double-edged sword, and you raise it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a completely valid point, and
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense. And it actually goes back to the whole idea of what's the purpose of political parties, right? Because
Yeah.
voters, in general, we are busy. We'll concede that, right?
Right.
The average person doesn't have time to research every detail of every single issue. And so that,
Yeah.
I think, is part of why political parties exist, is because they can group related issues and related solutions together. So in that sense, it's good. But then you run into this issue here where when you have corruption
Right.
happening, then that is undermining democracy, using the system that is actually supposed to bolster democracy,
Right.
to help voters out. It's actually manipulating them. And I think that's where we're running into trouble.
Well, we know that voters are very frustrated. We frequently get approached by voters who are very appreciative of the fact that we are running, that we've got new issues, that we're fair about the issues, that we're trying to discuss them with a level head, right, and not get all wigged out. But voters have I just want to talk about how this is going to be heating up for 2020. So voters are looking at a pipeline of elections coming up in 2020, especially in North Carolina, during a census here. So, the senator to tell us it'll be a governor's race. We've got the RNC here. So this city could be as explosive nationally in the next year as it has been in the past couple of weeks. So we could see more fake news, more manipulation, more just bad vibes.
Yeah.
The parties could be hunkering down even more
Yeah.
to manipulate our sentiments, try to dislodge competitors. We know, for example, just to repeat one of the themes that we've talked about in the past, we know that the DNC and the DCC are marginalizing progressive candidates who run on the Democratic ticket because they want to support incumbents. And so even the people that work for those candidates are getting essentially blackballed because they realize that 2020, it's a census year, it's going to be redrawing of districts. They desperately want to have majorities. So we haven't been attacked, but I could see that happening at some point.
Yeah.
So do you have any predictions about what you think the next year is going to look like if this goes on the way it's going?
I think so. And a lot of it does come down to districting. And I think you see this especially from the Democrats, because they are the ones who are the disfavored party in this case, as the court calls it.
Right.
You see them pushing more and more to the right, to the center from the left. That's why you see them pushing against progressive candidates. I know, just to cite a few examples, you have someone running in our district. So Dan McCready, who's the competitor in our race, he's the Democratic nominee, is very much a centrist, is very much a moderate. I don't think he calls himself a progressive.
Right.
Running in this district to capture that vote of people who are maybe more right-leaning Democrats, maybe people you might consider, what's the phrase, socially liberal but fiscally conservative. You see the Democrats propping up candidates like that. And that happened in our Senate races last year, too. You had business owners who were running as Democrats, but were, for all intents and purposes, old school Republicans before Republicans became so far right-wing.
Right.
So you see everything kind of shifting to the right. I think that's one thing that you'll see.
Yeah. So I guess in our race, McCready's strategy is just to be slightly less extreme than Dan Bishop, who is just to talk a little bit about our own race for a moment here. Bishop has put out some pretty horrible messaging on DHS and ICE and immigration, and it's not very pleasant to listen to. It would be more interesting if he made some legal arguments about why he thinks ICE detainers should be respected and these government administrative agencies given the power to do things like this. But as far as I can tell, I don't think they're going to debate. I don't think they're ever going to appear on the same stage together.
Probably not. I don't get that sense.
So let's then move on and talk and take this SCOTUS discussion just a little bit further and talk about some of the ways in which the parties do kind of monopolize the airwaves and monopolize the platforms. Because one of the things, and again, we're just going to go back to 2018 again and reflect for a moment on the cheating that took place. So one of the big realizations for me during the hearing in Raleigh, the 4.5 days where Mark Harris basically confessed and then eventually dropped out of the race, was that there is a lot of big money being spent in those small swing districts. Mm-hmm. Now, when you are tempting people with that kind of money, people who are making minimum wage, or single mothers that you can barely afford gas, to get around, election time is really, money from heaven kind of floating down, because people are going around. They're trying to get you to work on campaigns. They're paying a bounty on votes, and my first reaction was, well, they're scam artists and they're crooks, and some of these people are in very desperate situations, and I can't say that I would have done anything different being in their spot. Cutting corners to make $4, $5, $6 a vote. Making a couple phone calls, showing up. It's just doing that kind of field work in between your other jobs and the other things that you need to be doing as favors for other people. So that situation dawned on a lot of people, and that's just one of the implications of these millions of dollars spent to go out and engage in these very aggressive get out the vote campaigns, which turn out to be cheating. I mean, it just turns out to be flat out corruption.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of that. We know we don't want to be naive about politics. We know that people are running for office because they're representing certain types of interests. They're getting a lot of benefits from those interests. They're benefiting their friends and colleagues and local industries. They're giving inducements and incentives. We all know that goes on, and so that's a very unfair way of winning votes, winning support, using taxpayer dollars and then cycling it back into campaigns in order to boost your prospects. So that's one thing that makes the parties very powerful. So I've spoken too long. So Alan, go ahead and step in. I was ranting a little bit, but I learned to rant from Chris Cano. So there you go.
Just to add to what you were saying, and to sort of take it a little bit further, in terms of solutions, I think that there are ways that we can solve this. Like, I think that we can maybe not solve it completely, but we can at least address corruption. We can address the way that money flows through politics, because people could make the argument, I would be one of them,
Yeah.
that it's not always about winning for a lot of people. A lot of people just like controlling the flow of that money because that buys them influence in other ways. And so, yes, if you get into Congress, you have a certain amount of power, but even people who don't win are controlling tens of millions of dollars every election cycle. And that in regular life buys them a lot of power.
That's right.
One of the things that we can do to fix that is we can get that big money out of politics. One thing that the Green Party
Yeah.
is in favor of is publicly financed elections. And so I think that's one way that we can address it. Give candidates meet a certain threshold
Right.
of support, which is then matched by the federal government. We do
Yeah.
that for presidential races in some cases,
Right. Yeah.
That's one option.
Right. So I have some disagreements with that, but we don't need to explore that right now. Just because I think we had some things we wanted to cover here in the last 5 minutes with regard to different forms of political organization. I mentioned earlier that here we are in 2019, and the Democratic primaries have already started. So both Alan and I are in somewhat of a reactive position because the national media is focused on, what Kamala's saying and what Tulsi's saying and stuff, and that's fine because we've got responses to a lot of those things, but that takes a little bit of the focus off of this of us and in particular this race. So we've got 2.5 months left.
That's right.
And we want to reach voters in particular with our message. Yet we have some ideas about the way we can fix the state level problem that we now have with gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And we've also discussed the relative merits of other types of systems, whether that's some kind of proportional representation, which is what was discussed during the Supreme Court hearing. Also, there's the issue of ranked choice voting, which is kind of instant runoff. Someone who comes in third place, the people who voted for. This was described to me the other day. I'm going to try to do my best to describe it back, which is that if you're not familiar with ranked choice voting, it's just a way of giving the votes of someone who comes in third place to the other split between the other two candidates. However it is that you ranked out your vote. So that was a kind of a bad description. I admit. We're going to come back next week and we're going to perhaps explain it or provide a link to it later. We'll provide the links on YouTube about that. In any case, it's known as instant runoff, and it's a way to make sure that whoever your second place choice is has a shot, right? We know that we are not going to go to a parliamentary sort of system anytime soon, but given, I was just thinking, given the fact of this very long cycle for presidential candidates, this is ridiculous. It's only June and the election is going to be next year, so it's like 16 months. I'm thinking, why not a hereditary monarchy? Why can't we just go back to a system where somebody dies and a week later we're back in action, and we don't have to go through 16 months of this this massive ad buy, this massive fundraising effort, this pollution of the airwaves. I mean, most voters, I'm sure, are actually sick of that. I mean, we're kind of political junkies, so we're a little more attuned to it. But I know that average voters are just like, I don't want to hear this stuff.
It's true. Although if we did that, then the industry who manufactures debate podiums would just tank.
That's very sad. But then they could come here and pick up used. You could pick up used podiums here for a song. So we've only got a couple of minutes left at most. Alan, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap this up? I know we didn't talk about proportional representation, which was also something that came up during the SCOTUS decision, because the only way really to get something resembling a proportional representation meaning that, sort of minority parties like the Greens, like the Libertarians, and other independent-minded people, the only way to get them in really is by voting.
Yeah.
That's the only way to get independent and third-party candidates in. They simply have to win elections. And so that's the daunting part here.
Right.
So would you like to take us to the end here?
No, and that covered everything perfectly, I think. The only other thing.
You mean I'm perfect? Is
yes,
that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying, but don't hold me to that.
You heard it here
I will
first,
deny
ladies and
that.
gentlemen.
With every inch of my being. No, I think that there's so much that we can talk about with
Yeah.
regard to electoral reform because
Yeah.
there's so many different solutions, any of which could be really good,
Yeah.
or at least better than the system we
Yeah.
currently have.
So we're in a box here, and
Yeah.
we really don't know how to get out. So let's talk about next week because it's July 4th. Maybe we should pre-tape a show because a lot of people are going to be out on
That's
July
right,
5th.
yeah.
But it would be good for us to start talking a little bit about our anti-war message because Tulsi is getting a lot of Tulsi Gabbard of the
Right.
Democratic Party is getting some good feedback on her message. She's the only anti-war candidate, so it'd be good to review some of the things she said because I think we're largely in agreement with her, and I think it would be important for us to talk about that and devote a whole show to the military economy.
I think so.
Yeah. So look for that next week. Again, thank you for watching. If you are so inclined, please donate to our campaigns because we're going to be boosting these out on Facebook and YouTube to make sure that we have a wider audience. Please leave your comments if you've got any questions. Remember, jeffscottforcongress.com.
That's right. And AlanForCongress.com.
Thank you again.